You've found just stories, simple, heartfelt moments from real lives, stories that remind us how connected we all are through love, loss, and hope. Get cozy. The stories are about to begin. Sarah strode quickly down the sterile, endless hospital corridor. Today demanded maximum concentration. She urgently needed to finish the paperwork before two complex surgeries. One of them was particularly significant. The patient would be a little girl whose relatives were closely connected to Sarah's past, a past she would prefer to forget, filled as it was with pain, injustice, fear, and deep resentment. It seemed that chapter of her life was forever closed, and nothing would ever darken her new reality again. But recently, the echo of bygone days had made itself heard once more. The meeting in her office with those very people from the past was a shock. It was as if Sarah had been hit by an icy wave. She recognized them instantly, despite the years that had passed since that day when, a very young girl with a light backpack slung over her shoulders, she had essentially run away from home. They had changed, but it was impossible not to recognize them. The conversation was long and agonizing. There were no reproaches, although there was every reason for them. It was simply that a great misfortune had befallen these people. And here you couldn't help but think about the boomerang of fate. As often happens, it had also struck a completely innocent person, a little girl. She was the one who needed help. Sarah, an experienced doctor, had encountered similar situations before and knew how to act. The night after that meeting was sleepless. Sarah's children had long been dreaming in their rooms. Her beloved husband breathed evenly beside her, deep in sleep. Sarah tossed and turned, trying to ward off the unwelcome memories, but images of the past came alive before her eyes on their own, like frames from an old film. Sarah barely remembered her own mother. She only knew that she had existed, but the girl was only 4 years old when the closest person in her life was gone. Her father told her about her mother, but he did so reluctantly, perhaps because the memories caused him pain. As she grew older, Sarah noticed the shadow of grief that clouded his gaze when her mother was mentioned. And then Susan appeared in their house. Sarah was 7, and the new woman immediately took the place of full mistress. The stepmother didn't like mentions of her predecessor, so her father tried to remain silent so as not to upset his current wife. Sarah also had another important relative, her mother's cousin, Aunt Helen. She lived in another city, but Sarah had gone to stay with her for holidays since childhood, spending a week or two there each year. And before Helen moved, they had seen each other much more often. It was a happy time. Aunt Helen took the girl to theaters and museums. They walked, laughed, and talked about everything under the sun. Aunt Helen's son, Andrew, already a high school student, helped his younger cousin with math, carried her on his strong shoulders, and often took her out for walks. His friends, especially the girls, were very fond of Sarah. It was wonderful. But Susan felt unconcealed dislike for Aunt Helen. Even little Sarah felt it. The stepmother spoke badly of Helen, with a hint of disgust. Aunt Helen was not welcome in Sarah's home, and this upset and surprised the girl. How could anyone not like Aunt Helen? After all, she was so kind, cheerful, and wonderful. Aunt Helen often told Sarah about her mother, Tanya, mostly cheerful and interesting stories from their shared childhood and youth. The cousins were incredibly close. They had gone through a lot together, joys and sorrows, funny and dangerous moments. Aunt Helen sincerely admired Tanya, and Sarah loved listening to these stories and looking at old photographs that preserved the memory of the dearest person she had barely known. "How happy your mother was about your birth," Aunt Helen smiled, looking at Sarah. "She just soared with happiness. We made so many plans together about how we would raise you, develop you, educate you. You had such slender, as if skilled, fingers. Your mother dreamed that you would become a surgeon, that you would save people. She had a sick heart since childhood, a complex defect, and no one could help her. And she really wanted her daughter to help people like her, to make them healthy and happy." Sarah also noticed that Aunt Helen was very wary of Susan, and even of her father. No, she didn't say anything bad in front of the girl, but Sarah saw it in the change in her voice. in the expression in her eyes. The girl worried. Why did the adults who were so important to her dislike each other, barely restraining themselves when they met? Susan constantly found reasons for dissatisfaction. Either Aunt Helen brought Sarah home at the wrong time, or dressed her improperly for a walk, or the girl hadn't finished all her homework during the holidays. The nitpicking was endless. Unbeknownst to Sarah, visits to Aunt Helen became less and less frequent, and then some major scandal occurred between the adults, and communication with Helen stopped completely. Aunt Helen called only once after that quarrel. Susan graciously allowed them to talk. "Sweetheart, don't think I'm abandoning you," Aunt Helen said. "It's just how circumstances turned out. You won't understand yet. You're too little. You know my address. If something happens, be sure to come. I'll help you in a difficult moment. Remember this, you can always count on me." And that was it. That was their last conversation. After that, it was as if a line had been drawn. Susan explained that Aunt Helen had her own affairs, saying her son was applying to university, she had work problems, she didn't have time for her niece. But Sarah understood everything. She heard Aunt Helen call the house phone, but Susan answered and spoke to her rudely, without calling Sarah. One day Sarah saw Aunt Helen from the car window. She was standing in their yard. Sarah waved, but Susan immediately distracted her, and the car sped away, leaving Aunt Helen behind. Apparently her aunt was trying to arrange a meeting, and it wasn't easy, as she lived in another city and had to leave her affairs. But her father and stepmother unanimously shielded Sarah from contact with Aunt Helen, feeling a strong aversion towards her. The first time without her beloved aunt, the only person who understood and supported her, was very difficult for Sarah. At home, a completely different atmosphere reigned. Her father and stepmother had a daughter, Vicky. At first, Sarah was happy. A charming baby, a sister, a little doll. But the joy didn't last long. Firstly, Sarah saw for the first time how much tenderness and love parents' relationships with a specific child could be filled with. Her father worked a lot and couldn't give Sarah as much attention as she wanted. He asked about school, about how she was feeling, but it was clear that her answers didn't interest him much. When Sarah asked him to play, to give her a ride on his back like Andrew did, or just to walk in the park, to kick a ball, he would wave her away. His gaze was absent, as if he was thinking about something else while talking to his daughter. Susan, however, simply irritated Sarah. The girl tried to be perfect to earn her favor. She studied well, cleaned, played quietly. But Susan always found something to scold her stepdaughter for. Everything was wrong. And again, that look from Susan, the look at an annoying obstacle. It was impossible to not notice. And yet, at first, Sarah had been so drawn to her. She wanted what other girls had, shopping trips together, heart-to-heart talks, cooking. But Susan avoided such interaction in every way. However, she performed her parental duties flawlessly. From the outside, no one could fault her for poor care of the girl. And then Vicky was born, and Sarah saw her father and Susan from a completely different side. They could be loving, caring, attentive, just not with her, but with Vicky. The baby's smile, her cooing, her first successes, everything filled the parents with delight. They could admire her for hours, standing over her crib, happy, exchanging glances. Even with their last money, they threw Vicky lavish birthday parties, bought her the best of everything. Sarah got what was left over. The slightest achievements of her younger sister were elevated to the rank of genius, while Sarah, no matter how hard she tried, could not earn even modest praise. She studied brilliantly, was an excellent student, but this was seen as a matter of course. It was the contrast that hurt. No, Sarah didn't envy her sister's dolls and outfits. After all, she wasn't going naked. It was something else. Her parents always listened to Vicky with genuine interest. They enjoyed spending time with her. They were happy with her answers. And Sarah, she felt like an outsider, completely foreign in this family. Her father still sometimes tried to feign heartfelt communication with his older daughter, but it was clear that it was difficult for him, and he wasn't particularly interested in listening about her life. Susan, on the other hand, was simply irritated by the sight of her stepdaughter, and over the years, she almost stopped hiding it. Later, Sarah understood that it was Susan who turned her father against her, telling him only bad things, portraying her in a negative light. She did it skillfully and subtly. Her husband didn't suspect her true intentions, especially since he was rarely home. He worked a lot. He was even grateful to his new wife for helping him, for raising his child. Her father worked shifts away from home, and Sarah lived for months only with Susan and Vicky, feeling like a stranger in her own apartment. Gradually, Sarah acquired many responsibilities. She had to clean the rooms before Susan came home from work, go to the store, cook dinner, take Vicky to clubs and sections. 90% of the time, Vicky was too young to get anywhere by herself, and Sarah accompanied her, while also having many household chores, not to mention her homework. In high school, they assigned a lot. Sarah was used to doing everything conscientiously, so she stayed up late, and there was almost no time left for rest. Sarah tried to talk to Susan to explain how hard it was for her to live on such a schedule. Of course, there was no result. "You're just lazy," Susan sighed, "like most modern teenagers. But we, your parents, are responsible for your upbringing, and we're doing this for your own good." It was useless to turn to her father. He had been subtly influenced by Susan and felt grateful to her for raising his daughter so well, instilling a love for work, keeping her in reasonable strictness. Her father sincerely believed that Susan was the one to thank for Sarah not hanging around in yards, not drinking beer, and not smoking with other teenagers. "You'll appreciate this later," he explained to his older daughter when she tried to talk about her dreams. "Because of your age, you just don't understand what Susan is doing for you. She's preparing you for adult life." For adult life? Sarah wanted to cry from resentment. She wasn't little anymore and knew exactly what she wanted to become: a surgeon, preferably a cardiac surgeon, to treat those whom others had given up on. But you couldn't just get into a medical academy. It would be good to attend preparatory courses at the university. Sarah talked to her parents, trying to convey how important these courses were to her. "You know, we're not doing great with money right now," Susan shook her head. "And these courses are expensive. We can't afford them. And anyway, maybe you won't need it. Today you want to be a doctor, tomorrow a ballerina, and we pay for these whims when we don't have enough money as it is." And it was true. Her father had problems at work. His salary sharply decreased, and it was delayed. The family lived on previous savings, but money for Vicky's developmental classes, for birthdays, for dresses and treats, was always found. The parents saved on everything except their adored younger daughter. And it was difficult to forbid Vicky anything. At the slightest thing she would cry, throw tantrums, have hysterics, terrible scenes with snot and stomping her tiny feet. At such moments her father called Vicky a princess and hugged her close. Susan was also touched, and all the little princess's wishes were immediately fulfilled. They couldn't bear to see her tears. They couldn't refuse her. This wasn't Sarah. When the older girl tried to explain the situation to her stepmother and father, she ended up being blamed. "You don't understand that she's a child," her father said sternly. "A small child who doesn't understand financial problems. The little one must have a happy childhood." "It's all your spoilt nature plus innate selfishness," Susan said, pursing her lips and looking at Sarah. "You're an adult, and you don't understand anything. It's your jealousy, pathological. No, we missed something in your upbringing." Every time Sarah tried to talk to her stepmother or father, she felt misunderstood, rejected, and guilty. Of course, no one paid for the medical academy preparatory courses. The girl's desire was considered a whim, and she was advised to study better. How could she study better? She already had straight A's, despite the excessive household workload. By the way, Susan also attributed her academic success to herself, believing that she had instilled in Sarah a love for work. It was her final year, just a little more, and school would be behind her. Sarah still hoped to get into the medical academy. They hadn't paid for the courses, so she prepared herself. Fortunately, there was plenty of free literature online. Money was still tight in the family, but things seemed to be getting better. Her father found a new job, again involving long business trips. Before he worked shifts, but now he would be away for 3 or 4 months at a time. But the salary promised to be decent. Susan was happy about this. Vicky started school. Now Sarah had a new duty, to do homework with her sister. It wasn't easy. Firstly, Vicky had grown up very capricious. At the slightest thing she would cry. Minor difficulties caused hysterics. She cried, complained to her mother, who would pity her and ask Sarah to be gentler. How could she be gentler? Secondly, Vicky, let's say, struggled with academics, and she lacked perseverance. In short, Sarah broke out in a sweat before her sister's homework was done, and only then did the girl tackle her own assignments, again staying up late and almost falling asleep in class in the morning. From Susan, Sarah still heard only reproaches and complaints. Despite how much the girl did for her stepmother, helping around the house, looking after Vicky, there was no gratitude. Susan continued to see her stepdaughter as an obstacle, without whom everyone would be better off. Now Sarah had grown up, become smarter, understood a lot. This angered Susan even more. The stepmother didn't hide that she dreamed of the day Sarah would leave home. She told her husband that their life would improve and change when their older daughter became independent. It turned out that even her father saw Sarah as an annoying hindrance. Sometimes the girl shared her feelings with her classmate Chloe. She was quiet and intelligent, even wise beyond her years, a young girl with a soul that seemed to have seen a lot. "Your stepmother is a typical stepmother," Chloe shook her head, listening to Sarah. "But never mind. Life will put everything in its place. You'll see. You'll remember my words. And you yourself will stand firm, and everything will be wonderful for you with such a core." Her classmates' words encouraged her, instilled hope for a bright future, and gave her strength to live. Sarah did not abandon her dream. She wanted to become a surgeon and did everything possible for it. She knew that after school she would take her documents to the medical academy. The academy was only 3 stops from home. She could walk there. A tall, old building in the center. The girl often walked past it among the young men and women hurrying into this temple of science. It was her dream. And now her diploma was in her hands, red, special issue, and even a gold medal. Sarah was happy and proud of herself. She didn't go to the graduation party. Susan said they didn't have money for it. But Sarah herself wasn't very eager to go to the restaurant. She wasn't particularly upset. "Well," Susan said in the evening on the day she received her diploma. Her father, as usual, was on a business trip. "Now you are an adult. You're almost 18. We raised you, gave you everything. Clothes, food, a roof over your head. The time has come for you to fly out of the nest." "Where?" Sarah didn't understand. "Where do you mean?" "To work, of course. What studying? Sarah, leave these silly fantasies. Stop dreaming about the impossible. Medical academy? Do you know what the competition is like there? I checked. 12 people per place. You won't get in. Don't even dream about it." I prepared and I feel capable." That's your self-confidence talking. You will never get into such a university. Something simpler is certainly within your reach. But think about it. That's another 5 years of studying, and you need to work. "I need to study." Sarah looked at her medal. "I'm good at it." "School is one thing." Susan started to get angry, but hid it for now. "But this is university. In school they gave you grades for effort. In university you'll have to study for real. There won't be time for anything. And you're an adult, you should support yourself. Especially since we're short on money right now. Supporting an adult girl for several more years is an unbearable burden. I'll talk to your father." Actually, I already talked to him, and he completely agrees. "Sarah, you shouldn't waste years on studying. It's nonsense in our situation. Later, people with these same diplomas stand at cash registers, just like those who didn't finish university. I know for a fact." Susan herself worked as a cashier. She had dropped out of law college, and she often spoke spitefully about colleagues with economics and law degrees. "You just don't know life yet," she lectured her stepdaughter. "No universities, no courses, and no buts. I've already made arrangements. I have a friend who is the chief accountant at a housing cooperative. They need a janitor. It's not bad for a start." The main thing is they provide housing for a pittance in the reserve fund. That means you can move out tomorrow and start your own life." And then Sarah erupted. For the first time in her life, she allowed herself to speak to her stepmother like that. "You have no right to decide my fate. I will be a surgeon. That's final. It's my dream, and you are no longer in charge. You've humiliated me my whole life. Do you think I don't see and understand anything?" Sarah was seriously worked up. She had never spoken to her parents like this. She hadn't dared. But now all the accumulated resentment burst out. She screamed about her feelings, about the injustice, and, strangely enough, she felt lighter. She understood that after this, everything would change. "Oh, you ungrateful wretch!" Susan looked at her stepdaughter with unconcealed hatred. "Get out of here if you're so smart and independent." "This is my home too," Sarah reminded calmly. "Mine and Father's. You have no right to kick me out, but I will leave myself gladly." She started packing her things. She took little: money, documents, clothes for the first time. It made a small, light backpack, just what she needed. Sarah knew where to go, although she couldn't guess what awaited her there. After all, she and Aunt Helen hadn't communicated for so many years. But something told her. In Helen's house, she would be met with joy, like in childhood. They would support her, help her, give her strength to fulfill her dream. She should have left for there long ago instead of enduring the mockery. She left the apartment without looking back. Susan didn't even turn around. Sarah had no doubt. She would, of course, tell her father and portray her as always. Rude, ungrateful, almost a criminal. Her father would believe her. He believed every word his wife said. It was easier and more convenient for him that way. Well, it was time to admit that even her own father didn't understand or accept his daughter. He had made his choice. Nothing connected Sarah to this family anymore. Well, except for a shared inheritance, of course, but it was too early to think about that. At the station, she easily bought a ticket to Aunt Helen's city. The intercity bus was leaving in half an hour. Sarah took it as a good sign and smiled. Although she was shaking from the emotions she had experienced, the girl was almost certain this story would end well, and right now, at this very moment, she was taking an important and correct step. Aunt Helen was surprised to see her niece on the doorstep, but she recognized her immediately, even though they hadn't seen each other since Sarah was about 10 years old. They hugged. Finding herself in the arms of a relative, the girl finally gave way to her feelings. She burst into tears. Then they drank tea in the kitchen, talking. Sarah talked about her life. Aunt Helen listened, shaking her head, sighing. "Here's what," she said when Sarah had finished talking. "You're staying to live with me. There's a medical academy in our city, too. If you don't get in now, you can prepare for a year. They'll definitely take you next year." "I'd really like to, but Father, what if he doesn't allow it?" "You'll be 18 in a week. You can choose where to live yourself," Aunt Helen reminded her. "I won't let you go back there. I didn't realize you were having such a hard time living there. If I had known, I would have taken you through court long ago." Aunt Helen told her how Susan had forbidden her to communicate with Sarah, how she had turned her father against her. But it wasn't difficult. He's been under her thumb for a long time. She convinced him that I was a bad influence on you, that I was saying nasty things about them. And I called you often. I came to visit. But they wouldn't let me in, wouldn't let me see you. They returned gifts. I followed you on social media. Susan posted photos where you appeared. Your father did too. But I never found your page. I thought we could at least talk through messengers, but no. They didn't allow me to create accounts when I was a teenager. They said it took up too much time. And children shouldn't be on the internet. There are many scammers. And then, when I got older, I didn't feel like it myself. Perhaps your parents were afraid that I would communicate with you, Aunt Helen said thoughtfully. Hence the prohibitions. And why? Why did they always treat you so badly? Well, there's a reason, Aunt Helen smiled mysteriously. You're an adult now. I'll tell you the story, and you'll understand everything. Tanya and Helen were cousins, more than sisters, best friends. They slept over at each other's houses, went to school together, hung out, then went to discos. They had no secrets. They shared their innermost thoughts. Tanya had a sick heart since childhood. She was often in the hospital. Helen ran to her immediately after school, to her best friend. The doctors knew her and always let her in, even outside visiting hours. The adults, looking at their friendship, joked, "You'll fall in love with the same guy, and that will be the end of your friendship." The girls answered in unison that that would never happen. And it didn't. Helen was the first to get married, to a guy from university, tall, stately, smart, kind. Tanya approved of her sister's choice. You will be happy. And they were happy, but not for long. Helen soon became a young widow. Her husband drowned saving teenagers on the city beach. He pushed the boys out. But he himself... Helen was a very young mother then. Her son Andrew was barely 2 years old. Of course, Tanya was there for the inconsolable Helen during that difficult time. She even stayed at her sister's apartment for a while, looked after her, looked after little Andrew, tried to rouse her. Time passed. Helen slowly but surely began to recover. Life seemed to be getting back on track. Of course, she grieved for her husband, but finally remembered herself. Tanya was happy for her sister. She had been seriously worried about her condition for a long time. Then Tanya also married Robert, a man a little older, serious, deliberate. He earned well, although he had to work hard, which earned Helen's respect. Tanya's chosen one didn't exactly displease her, but Helen didn't understand what could have attracted her sister to him. They seemed to be cut from different cloth. Robert was taciturn, even stern. He didn't understand their jokes, and Helen considered that a serious drawback. You see, next to him, I feel, Tanya tried to explain, well, like behind a stone wall. And Helen understood. Tanya, her beloved sister, had lost her parents early. Perhaps she needed a reliable shoulder. And Robert was such a person. Immediately after the wedding, Robert bought a large apartment in a prestigious area. It turned out he had savings, plus his valuable employee status helped him at work. Tanya enthusiastically set about furnishing the new home. They went shopping, chose curtains, chandeliers, all those important interior details. It was exciting and pleasant. Soon, a child appeared in the family. A girl, Sarah. Helen's son, Andrew, was already quite grown up, almost a teenager. By the way, Sarah might not have been born. Doctors advised Tanya not to have a child. Her sick heart, it was unknown how her body would react. But Tanya believed that a family without a child wasn't a family. And her husband dreamed of heirs. And so, they decided. The pregnancy went perfectly, contrary to fears. The girl was born healthy and strong. It seemed everything had turned out wonderfully, but not quite. A year after giving birth, Tanya's condition began to worsen. The strain on her sick body took its toll. But Tanya regretted nothing. She followed the doctor's recommendations, had checkups on time, and took her pills. She tried to look after her health and not get nervous. The doctors say the most important thing with my condition is positive emotions and no stress. Well, you have plenty of positive emotions, Helen smiled, looking at her sweet, funny niece. Exactly, and I have no stress. Everything is good in the family. Helen hoped to get to know Robert better over time, to become friends. After all, he wasn't a stranger, her beloved sister's husband. But he remained distant and silent. Coming home and finding Helen there, he would greet her dryly and go into the bedroom. Does he not like me? Helen asked Tanya. No, of course not. He's just like that. And he has a lot of work lately. He gets tired. He's rarely home, constantly working late, on business trips. What can you do? It's a management position. But at least my daughter and I lack nothing. And otherwise, he's a good, kind person. He takes care of us, doesn't refuse us anything. But Helen knew her sister perfectly well and saw Tanya was being a little disingenuous. It seemed she herself was upset. Something wasn't right. Another year and a half passed. Sarah grew up and started kindergarten, and Tanya was constantly in hospitals, less often at home. She had to visit doctors more often than ordinary people and carefully monitor her health. Robert provided for the family but spent little time with his wife and daughter, constantly on business trips, late at the office. And at home, he behaved distantly, which Tanya explained away as her husband's fatigue. But Helen saw something was wrong. She felt sorry for her sister. And one day, Helen saw her suspicions confirmed with her own eyes. Yes, Robert was indeed cheating on her. That day, she received a call from school saying that Andrew had a fever and had been sent home. The worried mother took time off work. You never know, maybe her son needed help. That's why she was rushing through the station. It was a shortcut. And she saw them. Robert and his companion. Beautiful, slender, tall, with a model appearance. They were coming out of the waiting room. He was carrying both suitcases. And Robert was completely different from how Helen knew him. Enthusiastic, his eyes shining, his mouth never closed, a smile on his face. He looked at his companion with some kind of adoration, and she seemed to allow herself to be admired. Helen stopped, watching the couple. A couple of times Robert put his arm around the woman's waist, pulled her close to whisper something in her ear, and even kissed her once, passionately and quickly, because she immediately playfully pushed him away. There was no doubt left. And this was despite Tanya saying that her husband was on another business trip. But the train that had just arrived was a direct one from Sochi. Apparently Robert and the beauty had gone on a holiday, not a business trip. Helen even stamped her foot in annoyance. The doctors had advised Tanya to breathe the sea air, but Robert said he didn't have time, but going to a resort with his mistress, that was fine. Helen thought for a long time whether to tell Tanya. On the one hand, her husband was deceiving her, and Helen herself would have preferred to know such a bitter truth. But Tanya? She had a sick heart. Doctors recommended avoiding stress. Wouldn't the news be too much for her? In the end, Helen decided not to bother Tanya, but to talk to Robert. For the important conversation, she went to his work. Robert's office was in the center. Robert was surprised to see his wife's sister at his office door. "Has something happened?" he asked. "Something has happened," Helen replied grimly, and sat down opposite him without being invited, pulling up a chair. She told Robert everything she had seen at the station, in detail. Robert listened calmly, without even raising an eyebrow. And then, "Well, yes, I have a woman. There are real feelings between us. We have to meet secretly. I'm not thrilled about it myself. But why? Why? It happens. Feelings cool down. I thought Tanya was the one. I was wrong. Susan. It's different with her. I would have told my wife long ago, but you know yourself, her heart is sick. Tanya's condition is unstable right now. The doctors say it's a crisis. When it passes, I'll confess, we'll divorce, I'll help her get settled. Don't worry. But telling her about Susan now would be like sending her to the next world. You understand, don't you?" Helen thought about it. Of course, Robert was right. He was, of course, a scoundrel and a traitor for having an affair, but in his own way, he did care for the mother of his child, protecting her from stress. In short, they agreed to keep quiet for now. It was better for everyone, except for Susan herself, although she hardly believed that. At one fine moment, Helen still remembered that late evening, almost night. Andrew was asleep. He had school early. Helen was about to go to bed but couldn't tear herself away from a TV show. And then the phone rang. Anxiety squeezed her heart. It was too late for a casual chat. "How are you related to Tanya Smith?" a strange male voice asked. "Her sister," Helen replied, chilling with horror. She still hoped it wasn't that bad. "You need to come and pick up the child. The husband is on a business trip, and the daughter is too young to be left alone." "What's wrong with Tanya?" "You need to come," the voice repeated, "and as soon as possible." Of course, Helen called a taxi and was at her sister's apartment 15 minutes later. There were many people there, doctors, police. They talked to Helen, told her everything. She literally slid down the wall to the floor, sat on the cold laminate, covering her face with her hands. Tanya had had an attack. She died instantly. The doctors didn't make it in time. Little, bewildered Sarah approached Helen. Fear and incomprehension were in her eyes. Looking at her, Helen understood. She needed to pull herself together. Her niece needed her. "Will you take the child?" a man in uniform asked. "Of course," Helen nodded. "Naturally, I'll take her." Sarah stayed with Helen for almost a month. Robert was sorting out things at work. After all, he now had to look after his daughter. What kind of business trips could there be? He was looking for a nanny. All this time, Sarah lived with Helen, and Andrew helped his mother look after the little girl with great pleasure. And then Sarah's father took her, promising with his characteristic seriousness to visit her. "Can I come and see her?" Helen asked. "You absolutely should. I made you keys. Come whenever you want. Sarah is so drawn to you." "Good. Can I ask you something?" "I think I know what it's about," Robert nodded. "You want to know if I told Tanya about Susan? You're assuming the attack was because of that?" "Yes. Of course I didn't tell her anything." Robert looked at Helen with a direct, sincere gaze. "I would never have done that. We talked, remember? I knew that truth was dangerous for Tanya." Helen believed him. And then, several months after the tragedy, she found something among her sister's things. Sarah was happy that day. She didn't leave her aunt's side for a moment. When Tanya was visiting them, they decided to play dress-up. It was fun. The 4-year-old loved dressing up, and Helen, frankly, did too. Both enjoyed the game, and they even put on music. Helen opened her sister's closet. Her heart squeezed as usual at the sight of Tanya's things, which she would no longer need. They had chosen this blouse together. Tanya wore this skirt when they last went to the cinema, not knowing it was the last time. Helen sighed and tried to reach for a hat on the top shelf. The hat caught on something. She reached out her hand, and a pile of things tumbled down: headwear, scarves, and several photographs tied with a ribbon. Helen bent down to pick up the photos and was stunned. The pictures showed Robert and Susan hugging, kissing. One photo looked especially romantic, against the background of a sea sunset, tanned, clearly in love. So that was it. Tanya had found out after all. Perhaps that was what caused the attack. Helen turned over one picture. There was an inscription, made apparently with a lip pencil. "Let him go. He doesn't love you anymore. He's only with you because of your daughter. He won't leave because you're sick, so make the first move." Terrible text, hurtful words. Helen imagined how her sister must have felt receiving that message. She called Robert, and he behaved very strangely. "Why are you doing this? I've already lost my wife. I haven't recovered from the grief, and you're setting Susan up too. Why are you doing this? I understand you're upset that Tanya is gone. Maybe that's why you don't want me to be happy either, and you staged this sham." "Are you serious? Where would I get these photos? You don't understand anything. That woman of yours deliberately sent Tanya to her grave. She's a terrible person. She did this." But Robert stuck to his line, and Helen understood. Susan, that attractive, slender woman, had enormous influence over him, which is why he believed her. Cunning, cold, and deceitful. Helen had no doubt. Susan had latched onto Robert because of the apartment, his position, his earnings. She had a goal, and she achieved it. She destroyed her main rival. Maybe she didn't want her death, but the tragedy certainly worked in her favor. Before, they hadn't talked much, and now, not at all. Helen saw Sarah often. Usually, she would take the girl for the weekends. Robert still worked a lot. It seemed nothing stood in the way of the widower and his mistress's happiness. But for some reason, Robert wasn't in a hurry to bring Susan home. They met on neutral ground, lived together on vacation, but separately in everyday life. And only 3 years after the tragedy did Robert propose to Susan and bring her home to his daughter. Sarah had already started first grade by then, and from the moment Susan became Robert's legal wife, Helen was gradually discouraged from visiting the house. Helen had moved to another city by then, bought a larger apartment, and found a good job. She even thought about taking Sarah in completely because, well, what did Robert need her for in his new family? She wanted to get guardianship over her niece, which is why she improved her living conditions, so there would be no obstacles. But unexpectedly, Robert declared that he would raise his daughter himself. This was strange. He had never shown particular love for the girl, and he hadn't looked after her. He had simply hired a nanny when his wife died. They gradually reduced our contact to nothing. Helen looked at her grown-up niece. It wasn't difficult, considering I lived in another city. Susan tried in every way to keep you away from me, because she knew perfectly well. I know everything. I know what she did to Tanya. And she was probably afraid that I would tell you everything, that I would somehow prove I was right to Robert, and he would kick her out. It was unpleasant for her to have someone nearby who knew her whole dirty secret, so they pushed me out, and I tried. I tried to see you, but they were the parents, the legal guardians, and I essentially had no right to contact. And I thought Susan appeared later, after Mom was gone. Maybe they even delayed the wedding so you would think that when you grew up. No. Susan was in your father's life before the tragedy, and most likely, she was the reason for what happened to your mother. I was scared to leave you with such a person. But what could I do? And I watched you from afar. Everything looked fine from the outside. You wouldn't even think you were having such a hard time living there. What a woman she is. She didn't even spare a child. I'm not going back to them. Of course, you're not going back. You're almost 18. You can decide where to live yourself. Tomorrow we'll go to the university, find out what you need to apply. Did you bring your documents? Yes, I didn't have time to take many things. That's nonsense. We'll buy everything tomorrow. The main thing is the documents. Susan stood by the coffee machine, waiting for hot chocolate. She was incredibly sleepy. Little Christina had been restless all night, either difficulty breathing or chest pain. The illness of her granddaughter, Susan's greatest treasure, was progressing. The girl couldn't play with friends, couldn't go to kindergarten. Her daughter Vicky, she was clearly not ready for the difficulties of a sick child. She got stressed, capricious, angry at her daughter, who was not at fault. It was Vicky and a suitor who had the child in a drunken haze. And during the pregnancy, the future young mother didn't hold back. She smoked, indulged in beer. Susan tried to keep an eye on her daughter, but it was impossible. To watch an adult person around the clock. People were right. They had spoiled Vicky. And yet Susan just wanted her daughter to be happy. Developmental classes, gifts, surprises, birthdays. Susan invested all her resources in the child. Vicky had no household chores. Her mother believed she would have enough time to work later. Robert. He didn't interfere much in the upbringing of his younger daughter, trusting his wife completely. And he was constantly away from home, earning money. Susan was sure. You couldn't spoil a child with love. The whims would pass. The daughter would grow up to be a strong, self-respecting person. Only Vicky stopped studying, having gotten used to doing only what she wanted. She dropped out of school in 10th grade, declared she wouldn't go to university, not even a paid one, because she was tired of studying and wanted to enjoy life. She got involved with a bad crowd, started coming home drunk in the morning. Susan couldn't do anything with her unruly daughter. Neither could Robert. He didn't know how to behave with Vicky. He had never been involved in her upbringing, although he loved her very much. He transferred money, gave gifts. And then something terrible happened. Robert was in an accident returning from a business trip. Susan was left alone. However, she was quick on her feet, and Robert's apartment and accounts went only to her and Vicky. The paperwork cost money and effort, but it had paid off now. As for Sarah, she had been living in another city for a long time, far away, a lost cause. Susan wasn't interested in her fate. Neither was Robert. They only knew that Sarah had gotten into medical school, as she had dreamed. No other information. Sarah didn't communicate with her parents. Probably with her aunt, with Helen. Well, that was fine. Susan was satisfied with that. The main thing was that the apartment and money went to them. And then Vicky got pregnant by one of her perpetually drunk admirers. Christina was born, weak, pale. In the maternity hospital, they discovered a serious heart defect that people live with until 7 or 8 years old without surgery, and little Christina was already 5. Of course, Susan put all her efforts into treating her granddaughter. She herself was surprised by the strength of her feelings for the little one, whence she had once dreamed that Robert's money would provide them with a happy life. It turned out differently. Everything went towards expensive supportive treatment. The girl had undergone several surgeries, which slightly improved the situation but didn't solve the problem. It was terrifying to think about what could happen. Even Vicky, usually carefree and thinking only of herself, seemed to understand the seriousness and took care of her daughter as much as possible. But the main burden of care lay on Susan. In their city, they refused further treatment for Christina. They didn't have the facilities or specialists. And Susan, Vicky, and Christina went to Moscow. They were recommended a children's surgery center where they worked almost like magicians. Getting an appointment was difficult. The waiting list was long, but Susan pushed through. At the appointment, they were disheartened. The queue was huge. People came from all over the country, and most situations were similar, not tolerating delay. No one could be moved up, and by then, the girl's condition might worsen so much that no one would take her to the operating table. They prescribed medication, but whether it would help, no one knew. Susan drank her hot chocolate, leaning against the light hospital wall. Nearby, a bewildered Vicky sat on a couch, with Christina sleeping on her lap, unaware of the seriousness. And Susan could barely hold back tears of helplessness and despair. She couldn't do anything more. And suddenly, "Oh, Smith, bless her," one orderly said to another. Everyone had given up on him. His heart was full of holes, hopeless. But she performed surgery at night in her free time, didn't leave the table for 5 hours, and saved the boy. He'll live now, and he'll be healthy. A miracle. Smith is a children's cardiac surgeon from God. The other nodded in agreement. And a good person, if only there were more like her. "Excuse me, where is Dr. Sarah Smith's office?" Susan rushed up to the orderlies. She was almost certain. No, it seemed too fantastic, but still. Sarah was finishing another report when a woman from the past appeared at her office door. The one who had brought so much pain, so many problems. Susan. Beside her, holding a sleeping child, stood Vicky. Sarah recognized her sister too, although she had seen her as a primary school student. She felt fear, dislike, contempt, disgust, but also surprise. Why? Why had the past found her when her life had finally settled? Susan began to speak. She cried, asked for forgiveness, seemed genuinely remorseful. "What happened is possibly a boomerang, a punishment for how I treated you. But this child, an innocent child. You are our last hope, Sarah. Take her for surgery, otherwise she won't live to see her turn. You do this sometimes, I know. You take serious cases in your off hours. I can't ask you this after everything, but I am asking. I have no one else to turn to." Sarah looked at the little girl in her sister's arms, her niece, and she realized with surprise that she no longer felt resentment, and the dislike for these two women had disappeared somewhere. Before her were people, unhappy, frightened, in need of help, and a child, a seriously ill child. Sarah asked for Christina's documents. She needed to understand the scope of the problem. Susan readily produced a thick folder, test results, ultrasounds, scans. Yes, the situation was complex and brooked no delay. But Sarah knew she could handle it. She had experience with such cases. Of course, she would have to sacrifice her free time again. But that was such a small price compared to a child's life. It wasn't even worth mentioning. Sarah had gone into medicine to save people after all. This was her calling, her dream. "Some tests will need to be redone," Sarah said. "And don't worry, everything will be all right."